Saludos a todos, and thank you for joining us for Evening Conversations. My name is Mariana Garcia. I'm a museum educator at Connecticut's Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old State House, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our virtual event, The Undocumented Americans, a conversation with Karla Cornejo Villavicencio. This event is sponsored in partnership with El Institute of Latina, Caribbean, and Latin American Studies at the University of Connecticut. El Instituto is a multidisciplinary research and teaching institute that advances scholarship, creative endeavors, and instruction and advising in the fields of Latinx and Latin American studies. Its mission is to advance knowledge about the lives of Latino people in Connecticut, nationwide and around the world, as well as provide research support to UConn students and faculty. We're delighted to be working with El Instituto again. And our goal at the Connecticut Democracy Center is to link history and civics and encourage participation in state government. And one of the most talked about issues in policy today is immigration. Though this is a topic that everyone has an opinion on, most of us are yet to hear the stories of the people that live with it every single day. Today, we will be talking to Karla Cornejo Villavicencio, author of the National Book Award finalist, The Undocumented Americans, to hear about her experience uncovering and writing about these stories while also sharing her own. Today, we're also delighted to be joined by Fany Hannon, director of the Puerto Rican and Latin American Cultural Center at UConn, who will be facilitating the discussion. Before we start with the event, I would encourage you all to please leave your questions in the comments and we will get to those. And also after the program, please do take a minute to fill out our survey. You can find a link to that in the description of this video. So I'll just introduce Fanny real quick. A native of Honduras, Fanny came to the United States when she was 20 years old, not knowing how to speak, write, or read English. She enrolled in English as a second language classes at Miami-Dade College, where she started in the second level. Later, Fanny fulfilled her dream of pursuing a bachelor's degree in Latin American Studies and a minor in Brazilian Studies from Smith's College. After working for many years in Miami-Dade College, Fanny found her calling to work in higher education and student affairs. In 2006, Fanny was admitted as a graduate student in the Higher Education and Student Affairs program, master's program at the University of Connecticut. Currently, Fanny is the director of the Puerto Rican and Latin American Cultural Center at UConn. A role she treasures, for her work with students is her calling and not a job. She is also an affiliate faculty member with El Instituto and is almost done with her doctorate in higher education administration at the New England College. So, Fanny, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll leave you to it.
Thank you so very much, Mariana. It's a pleasure to be here. And now I have the opportunity, hello everyone, to introduce to you all our wonderful author and writer, Karla Cornejo Villavicencio. With the publication of her debut book, The Undocumented Americans, Karla Cornejo Villavicencio became the first undocumented finalist for a National Book Award. Her book was also named by Barack Obama as one of his favorite books of 2020 and was selected as one of the best books of the year by the New York Times, Time, NPR, the LA Times, the New York Public Library, Book Riot, Vulture, and the Library Journal. The Undocumented Americans is also a finalist for the National Book Critics Cycle Award for Best First Book. Karla has written about immigration, music, beauty, and mental illness for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the New Republic, Glamour, Elle, Vogue, N+1, and the New Inquiry, among others. A graduate of Harvard University and a doctoral candidate in the American Studies program at Yale, Karla lives in New Haven with her partner and their dog. She's a senior fellow at the Emerson Collective. And without further ado, please help me to welcome Karla Cornejo Villavicencio. Bienvenida, Karla.
Thank you.
So, Karla, I had the privilege and the opportunity to read your book. So I have a few questions for us to start, this dialogue. And I hope that as we go through the night, that obviously the audience will join us as well. So first of all, congratulations on being a finalist. Do you know when are you going to find out the results of the books?
I have told my editor and my team to not talk to me about award shows. I went to the National Book Award ceremony, and I don't like award shows, so I don't know when they happen, and I have no way of knowing.
It's all right. So, Karla, I couldn't put your book down. I cried, I laughed. It really brought me to many different places. And through your words, I met different people, different stories. And the way that you write is so poetic, it's so inspiring, but also so truthful to the stories that you wrote in your book. So I want to start by reading this quote from your book. And then I will ask you the first question. This book is not a traditional nonfiction book. Names of persons have been all changed. Name of places have all been changed. Physical descriptions have all been changed. Or have they? End of quote. What was your why to write this book? To tell the stories of many undocumented laborers, workers, to tell the story of the many undocumented Americans?
It was, it was after the 2016 election. I think that a lot changed for my understanding of what my role was as an artist. For a long time, I believed that part of my my journey as an immigrant was to not replicate the patterns that I saw with my parents. And so my parents had lived their lives defined by immigration. And I thought that even though I was undocumented, I couldn't, I didn't want to live my life completely defined by immigration. And so I didn't write about immigration with my name for a long time. And so I had written about music. I wanted to be a music journalist. But 2016 changed that. And I thought, I had been reading James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. And he, at some point in some of his writings, he had talked about how he struggled with mental health, and he didn't want to necessarily write about race to the extent that he came to. And he felt like he had to pay his dues. That's what he called it. And so I thought that it was about time that I paid my dues too. I don't think about it in quite the same terms anymore. I don't think that we necessarily have debts to anybody but ourselves. But I knew that I could write about immigration in a way that was different than it had been written about before. And part of the reason why is that I had never seen my parents in the ways that that TV or Hollywood or writing or even academic writing had seen them as like laborers or as people who had dreams and then just were sort of like just smiling in pursuit of those dreams, even though they suffered. So I knew I had something different to say.
Thank you, Karla. So let's really talk a little bit about your parents, your family, your mom, your dad, your brother. One of my favorite passages of the book is when you scolded, your brother, lo regañaste, because when he was not going to community college, he was not doing his part. So let's talk about the influence of your family in you, but also certainly, in your writing.
Sure. One of the things that I think is one of the contributions that I'm proudest of having made in Latinx and the Latinx canon so far is that my debut book was not dedicated to my parents. My debut book was dedicated to a young migrant woman who I felt a connection to, even though I'd never met her, Claudia Gomez Gonzalez, who had been killed by Border Patrol. And she was a young woman who wanted to become a nurse. And when I read about her and I saw her photo, I felt a connection to her. And I think that is a story of chosen family and of the connections that we can make. And I love my parents, but I've come to realize through connecting with so many readers and through also my research, and I'm 31 now, and I sort of started writing about my parents when I was in my 20s. And a lot of it was around the same themes that a lot of young immigrants are sort of trained to talk about their parents in, which is like gratitude. I owe everything to my family. I'm graduating today because my parents crossed, things like that. And it's true, you know, like my parents made sacrifices for me in order for me to have a greater life here. But what's also true is that children of immigrants often feel a lot of burdensome oppression about having to repay certain debts. And that's not fair. You know, our parents have had to live lives not necessarily making their own choices or following their own dreams. And it's a continuation of intergenerational trauma for us to try to repay debts to them and to live a life in not pursuing our own dreams and making decisions that are based on someone else's decision. So at the last minute, I decided to not dedicate the book to my parents. And it was a very freeing act because it allowed me to think of my art as something that is separate from them. I do write about them sometimes, but I also can choose not to. And, you know, I'm not a writer because of them. They are my parents, and they, of course, encourage reading and writing. But a lot of parents who encourage reading and writing have children that don't become writers. So, you know, they're my family, and they're also a topic that I write about.
Thank you, Karla. And I wanted to tell you that chosen family is one of the themes that we talked a lot in our classes back at the university. We talk a lot about familial capital and what familial capital means, that it's not only about your birth family, but also the chosen family that we encounter, that we meet, over a year. So I'm so excited. And I hope that the students that are here with us, that they will ask you or they will comment more about that, because it's so great to see a fellow Latinx, giving the same message, you know, that we read, from Tara Yosos and some other Latinx, scholars, that familial capital as a chosen family is something real. So, okay, so let's talk, about, your book, because I was fascinated by the different places and the different stories that you took me through your book. So you chose different locations: New York, New Haven, Cleveland, Flint, but every single one of those places is about the people that you met. And I believe that you are also an ethnographer, because for me, every single chapter is an ethnography. You were able to be part of that community, be intentional. You attended the mass, you went to church. You also attended a voodoo session in one of the chapters in Miami, which is one of my favorites. So why did you choose, how you were able to choose the stories of the places? How did the book start taking form?
You know, I did go to grad school, and one of my advisors was an anthropologist, an American anthropologist. So that, it didn't teach me like method necessarily, but we did talk a lot about ethics. And so I think that the representational choices that I make in the book, how I set about doing my interviews, recording my interviews, depicting my interviews, quotes, everything like that. It's something that I've been, it's choices that I've been thinking about for years. So the places were sort of like, I found stories that I thought were interesting and that hadn't really been written about in either just generally or in ways that I thought were cool. And I went to those places. I did consider like having geographic diversity. And I'm like, so not going to the South was a choice. I was undocumented, and also I just didn't want to go. I was considering like I felt obviously like I needed to go to the West Coast, but there was a story that I wanted to do in the West Coast that it was such a specific story about like a specific group of people that even if I had changed every single identifying detail, you would have still been able to find the people that I was going to write about. So I decided to axe it. And that's how I ended up on those cities.
Karla, there was a quote, like I said at the beginning, there's so many quotes, from your book that really spoke to me. And there was this powerful quote when you wrote about Flint, and as well, Liliana and Margarita. And I encourage everyone to read your book because it's a totally different, narrative. And the quote in particular that in the Flint, chapter, and I want to, read it for the audience. It reads, "What I saw in Flint was a microcosm of the way the government treats the undocumented everywhere, making the conditions in this country as deadly and toxic and inhumane as possible, so that we will self-deport." End of quote. And I think that quote is so powerful, but also is the story of what you saw in Flint with the people that you met there. So what I guess, I want to know a little bit more about, your experiences to being there in Flint.
Yeah, that was tough. I mean, I met a lot of really lovely people. I met a lot of Mexican Americans who were many generations in, and their connection to the undocumented community was really interesting to see. And it's not something I write about at length, but I write about mixed status families. I write about the way that undocumented people relate to each other or to Anglos. I don't often write about the way that Latino citizens who are not Cuban, which I discuss a little in the Miami chapter, relate to undocumented immigrants. And, that's interesting. And it doesn't always have to be a story about resentment over citizenship. And this is one of these stories where it's you have Mexican Americans who were wearing like zoot suit t-shirts, and they had like family members who had been in law enforcement, and then you had Mexican newly arrived undocumented immigrants, and they were going to the same cultural center and attending the same parties, and I think in a lot of communities, like I come from New York, and there's some stratification there because of class status. And here it's just obviously it's much smaller. And there were some. I went to a party. I didn't write about this in a book, but I think it was a lady's 80th birthday party, and it was just everyone from like a church, because it was also an encounter with Catholicism that I had, which was whether people seemed to be very like religious or not. It was like a cultural Catholicism that was very important to the community. And like I said in the book, because the government is so absent from Flint or is actively killing people, churches are really important. And the Catholic Church is very important in Flint in a way that like it isn't in New Haven. And it isn't necessarily in New York City, or it isn't anymore. And so those were some like really interesting pockets that I got to see. And I don't write about it at length in the chapter, but I read about other things in the chapter about Flint that surprised me or that stayed with me. But I thought Flint, it's also, so somehow people talk about like the Eiffel Tower. Edward Said, writes about the Eiffel Tower being the most reproduced photograph in the world. And I'm someone who really bristles at that sort of thing. I don't like looking at sunsets because I feel like I've seen so many like sunsets on calendars and things like that, that I just don't really feel an emotional connection. And that's sort of how I felt like looking at the poverty in Flint as someone who also comes from like a low income place, but it's urban poverty, not, I felt like I had seen it in like so many Michael Moore movies. It felt really disrespectful to look for too long, you know? So that's how I felt about Flint.
Thank you, Karla. And I think that one of the again, I think that what I love about, your book, another piece that I really enjoy is I will be reading, about a story that you had, somebody you met, in Flint, like, Liliana or Margarita, and then you will transform me to a different, piece, for a personal, story that you had. And one of my, again, I have to go through my favorite, chapter, which was, Miami. My family is, lives in used to live in Hialeah. So then they move, to, Fort Lauderdale. But I really love how in the Miami chapter, you met, these wonderful women. And I don't want to give it away because we know we have you here. So can you tell us a little bit more about that amazing, chapter about Miami and the women, and as well, the other aspect, that how the connection with the voodoo, and that it was not Santeria, but it was so important to connect with to keep, the women together. So I just, like I said, I just love, what you experience in Miami as well.
Yeah, I think I don't have much to say about the voodoo or Santeria other than like in the book I discuss certain practices that immigrants turn to in absence of health insurance. And I have complicated feelings about that. Just actually generally complicated. Sometimes people say complicated and they just mean they negative. And the story of the woman came at a really great time in my life, because my mom had, at that point, was separating from my dad and was in her early 50s. And some of these women were in their late 40s or early 50s when I first met them. All of them were undocumented and had really started to embrace activism. And it sort of started with immigration activism. For some of them, the gateway drug was Dreamers. And then they became more and more radical. They started like doing demonstrations in front of the ICE building. They did one of them where it was like, I did a hunger strike. And then she was like, it was more of a fast. They had recollections of their younger years that I think was good for them to say out loud. And some of those recollections included a cold, hard look at why they got married and what the expectations are for young women in nuestros países, in our countries, to marry and to have, heterosexual relationships. And, some of them had been divorced. One of them was a widow. They were all, I just sort of described a long scene in which they all wanted to take me to a nightclub to dance with gay men. And then they wanted to take me to a casino. They were just all like really happy about living life. And they were like, how could you just want to go home and go to sleep early? Like, you're so young. And that reminded me of my mom, because my mom is sort of able to make her own decisions for the first time, being able to, because she's working, she has money of her own. My dad is not micromanaging her life anymore. So I found that these women in middle age had also been politically radicalized and had also really found their own voices, and were really happy to talk about that with me.
Thank you, Karla. So like I said, I truly enjoy, the chapter, all the chapters, but the chapter, spoke, highly to me. So I'm going to look at the comments right now, because we have some questions from our audience, and I think that will be great, so we can mix things up. So Karla, do you expect the kind of attention your book has gotten?
No. Well, that has two answers. I expected a lot more attention because I thought, I'll tell you the truth, because I can't lie. I expected a lot more attention in some ways earlier on, because I think someone around my age, like I think young women who are cisgendered and who are femme presenting and are pretty and are inspired by Joan Didion, they tend to do pretty well, you know, when they write at my level of talent. And I did not get like photo shoots. I didn't get like invitations on podcasts where they asked me about my skincare routine. I wasn't considered like an it literary girl. And that had a lot to do with the fact that I'm Latina. Latinos don't have that kind of cultural capital. We don't get viewed as literary stars, you know? My book was reviewed and I was like, people acted as if though this was just like me writing a diary entry, or, you know, as if I was discussing policy. You know, I am grateful when people discuss my book as undocumented literature, but I see myself more on syllabi that are about classes about migrant literature than in English classes or classes about essays or things like that, right? So you get pigeonholed because of your race immediately in a way that even other literatures of other ethnic groups aren't. And so it was really hard to be respected as a literary writer writing a literary work. I had to write really hard. One of those reasons is my resume. I went to Harvard, one of the first undocumented immigrants, right, to go to Harvard, to graduate from Harvard, went to Yale, just because of the time period we're living in, because of my age and because of this particular set of skills that I have. And I know that's a line from Taken. I just ended up being the first to do a lot of things. Because I'm in the arts, you know, like not a lot of undocumented kids become like essayists. And people seem really focused on those achievements. And so then when people describe me, they're like the Harvard grad, the dreamer. And you don't become a well-respected like writer if you're just a dreamer kid. So I had to fight really hard. I knew that there were people in charge of publicity, but I did my own publicity because I wanted to be in control of the narrative of how I was represented. So I'm not surprised by the success of the book, like among readers, because I think we've been waiting a long fucking time for a book like this. I wasn't surprised about the positive reception critically, because it's a good book. I was surprised by the kind of reception, like when people would like thank me for my story. And I was like, one, I got paid to write this. You don't, like, I didn't serve you something. Or when men would be like, you write very well. And I'm like, yeah, like I do this for a living, you know, like the kinds of interactions with my voice I was not expecting, but everything else I sort of was.
And one of the pieces that I wanted to tell you is I do agree with you because, again, everyone, please read her book. But one of the pieces that I want to say is your book is full of so many different aspects, you know, policy, anthropology, literature. It's not, you know, I couldn't place, I mean, you know, I can place your book in so many different, you know, categories. And I do agree with you. Definitely will be in syllabi and will be used, including myself, by many other, I mean, folks that we do this work, I mean, in teaching. But I think as well as the policy, I mean, level and law and in legal aspects, your book brings a different light, a different voice, I mean, to, you know, and give voice and amplify the voices of our undocumented Americans. Okay, so the next question I have is from Rebecca, and Rebecca is, she would like to know, she's curious to hear from you. If you could please talk a little bit about undocumented immigrants in Connecticut.
You know, I've always really marveled at people's undocumented immigrants' ability to survive outside New York City, because that's what I know. And New York is a big city. And first of all, it's harder to be anonymous in small places, in small towns. Like, I'm the only person of color in my neighborhood. I'm one of three people of color in my neighborhood. If like I wanted to hide, or if I wanted to be anonymous and not leave a paper trail, like I couldn't do it. And I know that there are like neighborhoods that are mostly Latinx and stuff, but it's like in New York, it's just so different. I spend a lot of time in Connecticut thinking about how much I stood out and how much immigrants must stand out. There's no like huge service and restaurant industry here. So people are in different kinds of jobs. And that's another like wonderful thing that I think people, when they think of undocumented immigrants, they often think of the border, and they often think of like farm workers or day laborers. And undocumented immigrants do everything, right? Like there was a point where I was on DACA and I was, being a TA at Yale, and I was teaching, like famous people's children as an undocumented immigrant. And they didn't know. They still don't know, I was undocumented. My uncle was undocumented and he was a janitor. Like my friend is undocumented and he's Jose Antonio Vargas, who, is in Hollywood and is in advocacy and was on the cover of Time magazine. Like, he's not in Connecticut. I think I'm the best thing Connecticut's got. But, I hung out with these young girls and they were like, that person's famous. And I was like, I didn't think I know them. And they were like, no, New Haven famous. So, I'm sure that there are undocumented immigrants in Connecticut who are like rocket scientists. I know we have one of the Connecticut schools, Dreamer team here. I'm sure they're doing like crazy shit. I have one of my readers who is doing like vocal cord experiments on finches. Undocumented, there is a diversity of flora and fauna. Oh my God. This is, of course, my mother. I'm sorry about that. There's just so much undocumented diversity in Connecticut. But, that's another thing that when I traveled across the country, I was just aware of the different jobs that were available and the different ways of surviving. Like in New York, there was a tradition of la colecta, where because there are enclaves and there are like communities that are. This was like in Queens, where it's just so immigrant rich. There are some advocates who would go to just nightclubs or restaurants or cafes and say, this person died, he doesn't have any family, we need money for a funeral. And people would just take out cash. And I think like if you're in a rural area, there might not be such a tradition as la colecta. There is still here. I went to an Ecuadorian restaurant that I frequent, and they have like a little box where you put in cash, and they have like a different cause from like a local immigrant, like a local neighbor every like month or so. So I've learned a lot about undocumented people in Connecticut.
Thank you, Karla. And that was totally fine about the phone call. Please do not worry. We have more comments and questions, for you. So I wanna honor that. Okay, so the next question. So somebody wants to know, what does Karla feel is the right forward for undocumented? Is the right way forward for undocumented immigrants?
Wow, the right way forward for what? I'll interpret the question. I think the right way forward for undocumented immigrants is taking care of their mental health. And that is, for those of us who have access to resources like therapy through insurance, if you are insured, or if you make a lot of money and are able to afford out of pocket, I think taking care of your mental health, that is like very specific. It's hard work. It means making boundaries with parents, with family. You're not responsible for everybody. I think it means acknowledging that there's intergenerational trauma in our families. I think for older folks who don't have the resources to like do these things, I think it's maybe like with the help of friends and family and children and all of that, I think like, encourage your parents to like seek a sobriety group or an AA class in Spanish if you see that they've struggled with self-medicating for a while. Or, maybe recommend some new music to them so they stop listening to, songs that make them sad from the old country. I don't know, the most important thing that has happened in my parents' lives in the past few years, now that they're in their mid-50s, is that they're pursuing their own goals that are independent from us, their children. And that has led to a big difference in their lives.
Thank you. And I think this is a very good segue for the next question from the audience. A fascinating book. How different are immigrants described in it from earlier generations of immigrants in Connecticut and American history, Eastern Europeans, Asians, etc.?
I mean, for different. So, are the immigrants described differently from previous waves of immigrants from previous waves of immigration? I mean, that's comparing apples to oranges, right? Are they compared differently from what works of that time would have described their immigrant groups? Yeah, because like different waves of immigrants in the past, I think were written during time periods where there was a lot of eugenicist language. So I think they would have included eugenicist language. And I don't include eugenicist language in my book.
Okay, so there's a comment and Karla, can you also see the comments or on your? Okay, so I'm gonna, because I want to honor.
I can just read it very quickly.
So hold on. I think this is a comment. First, I just want to say it was amazing reading your book. As a child of an immigrant, I felt like I was reading about people I knew or know of. There's a part where you talk about how the importance of education to be successful was instilled in you, and you have sort of like an internal conflict when people decide to take another route besides a 4-year college. Can you talk a bit about this? Do you still have this conflict? And how have you worked to see otherwise?
I do still have this conflict. I think it's good that I don't come up with a solution to this conflict because there's no solution. It's like, this is a country we live in. And I think that some people can't do college. I think college really isn't for everybody. I think the pandemic is changing the world in ways that I don't understand yet, and nobody can predict. Having gone through college, I know college isn't for everybody. The young people that I know in my life, who are children of immigrants, I have lobbied very aggressively that they go to college. For my own brother, I didn't give him the choice. So, those are different things. So like, my stance is that college isn't for everybody and you should choose the path that best works for you, but you have to not be a dick about it, right? You can't be like, my mom has diabetes and I have to like take care of her financially because that's just the reality. That's not something you can draw a boundary for. And you can draw some boundaries related to it, but like when it comes down to something, it comes down to something, and you're like, I want to be, I want to be a DJ. Like don't be impractical, right? But you can do something that you're fantastic at, and you can make money. Like, I don't know. Everyone has to make their own choices and live their own lives. But the people in my life who are young and children of immigrants, I lobby very hard that they get college degrees.
And one of my dreams, Karla, is that we can certainly turn, that discussion, in this country, that we can empower our youth to learn, right? So if we focus them to learn and find what is their vocation, then they can certainly, be who they are and become, the many possible selves. And I think that will be, amazing if we can have, this educational system, and even, at college level too, that we can help them to find who they are, what is their vocation, instead of, selecting that specific, major to strengthen, their talents and skills. Okay, so we have more questions coming in for you and comments. Somebody said, I cannot wait to read your book. So I'm very excited to see that. And then the next question is, were the changes made to people's stories in the book done only to preserve their anonymity, or were there literally purposes too?
The changes made to people's stories were done to preserve their anonymity. The choices that I made for literary purposes were done for literary purposes, right? So change is, I think, something that it like alters the shape of something, like when you alter a garment so it can fit your proportions better. And I think those are when I like changed a name, right? But when I made choices to, like, for instance, I know how he died. I know where he was buried, all of those things for Ubaldo Cruz Martinez, whose name I did not change. So I didn't change the facts of the case. I created like a magical realist scenario about the last few minutes of his death. And for those people who haven't read my book, he was a day laborer who became an alcoholic, and he became homeless, and he died during Hurricane Sandy alone, and having squatted in a basement. And a lot of the day laborers that I interviewed had known him, had been friends with him, but they seemed very sad and sort of embarrassed to have to talk about him, because they're so worried about being day laborers considered to be nuisances. And he had a bad reputation, right? And so I decided to explore that a little bit, because I was like, at various points in my life, if I had suddenly died and there had been an autopsy done on my body, and there had been, there would have been substances in my system, like pharmaceuticals, maybe like I was drinking, like it's sort of like when, after Michael Shepard was killed, someone recalls a professor saying, like, well, he wasn't an angel because he was involved in drugs. I just felt like I needed to change the last few minutes of his life to both acknowledge the humanity of someone who may well have been an alcoholic, but also to reclaim that death for the immigrant community. Because I thought, of course, people are self-medicating, and some people are drawn to addiction. And I thought that death had as much to do with migration than it did with Hurricane Sandy and drowning. So that, for example, that scene was made up, but that was done for a literary purpose. And Ubaldo is the only person in the book whose name I do not change, I use his real name.
I'm so glad you mentioned Osvaldo's, because that's one of my favorite stories, and the way that you wrote about him, and as well, you know, the loving and caring that he had for the squirrel was, I love it. So everyone, another piece, I mean, so you need to get her book. So we have another comment and question from Diana. Mental health within the undocumented community is a very important theme in your book. How do you believe we can begin the conversation around it for those who are still very negados to accepting it as a part of our reality?
That's a cute picture, Diana. Selena Gomez likes to do this pose a lot in her pictures. So I was talking about this with my partner the other day. You know, a few people are pretty happy to talk about mental health. I feel like, I think like the younger generation, Generation Z, like talks about mental health a lot. People talk about self-care a lot. And people don't really talk about mental illness. There's the stigma is around mental health, the stigma is around mental illness, right? And so I think that we already talked to our parents about mental health. We're like, did you take a bath? You know, would you like a cup of hot cocoa? Would you like to watch a movie? My mom was using face masks, right? All of these things that we associate with like white woman influencer, self-care, mental health day kind of stuff. Even if we don't use those words, you'd think that, well, those are all self-care things. Those are whatever. I think like mental health issues, mental illness in the community is something that even people outside of the community don't talk about. Like mucho menos people in the Latinx community who just have less familiarity with the language. And also there's, I guess, the cultural belief that like, you shouldn't let weakness show. And you associate a lack of ability to tough it out with weakness and therefore sensitivity, depression, anxiety, PTSD, addiction, panic attacks, all these things that are symptoms or diagnoses themselves, they become scary. I think one way we could approach it is by describing them as medical and as symptoms rather than a diagnosis, right? So that's the way that my psychiatrist likes to talk about my mental illness too. You know, we talk about it in terms of symptoms and not diagnosis. And some people do prefer that. So I think like we can tell our parents, like, if we're talking about depression, describe the symptoms, you know, be like, when I get sad, there are periods of my life where I don't want to get out of bed and where I lose my appetite. And those periods like come and go. And I need to take a medication that's going to help me sleep better, get my appetite back, and increase my mood. Like that sounds like a medical thing. And they're not going to say, you know, maybe you should pray more, maybe you should read the Bible in response to that. I don't think. I was fortunate enough that when I started getting diagnoses, my dad would go to the library and he like get books that were like, what is anxiety? If your people in your community or your family are readers, you know, there are some basic books that are like, I think libraries carry a lot of, at least the ones in New York did, whatever for dummies, books in Spanish. And there are some that are about like PTSD and anxiety and stuff like that. I think a lot of people are willing to learn when I've discussed things with people who are not my parents. I've sent them articles from like CNN Espanol and things like that about like trauma, whatever. I know when I've been diagnosed with several things, I look up an article, even if it's Wikipedia, and I send it to my dad. And then my dad, before I talk to him about it, so he doesn't ask shady shit, And then he's like, oh, okay. I think also Latinos love authority figures. So like, you're like, look at this doctor wrote this article. They're going to be like, okay, at least that's been my experience.
Thank you, everyone. Please keep your questions coming. So, Karla, I have to ask you this: will you write your book in Spanish?
It's coming out in Spanish. I still have to. It's coming out. It's coming out in different languages. It's coming out. I don't rewrite it. I get it. There's a translator, and then there's a different publishing in print. It's coming out in Catalan. It's coming out in Japanese. It's coming out in Polish, and in those countries. So I'm really happy that because there are migrants in all countries, and people are acknowledging that, they're not printing a lot of copies. There's not a great demand for essays on undocumented immigrants, but there are people who are recognizing that people want to know about the migrants in their country. And most of those people, given the readership of my book, are like children of migrants who want to know about about their family and about their community. So the Spanish one, I wanted to come out in Latino Spanish, Latinx Spanish, and that's different than like Latin American, Mexico City Spanish. So I got a translation that was written in that Spanish, which is like very formal, closer to Spanish from Spain. But Latinx Spanish, particularly the Spanish that I grew up speaking, was really inspired by like telenovelas, right? Because obviously the Spanish that I heard was Spanish from my parents and Spanish from Univision and Telemundo, and from the people in my community who were Puerto Rican speaking Spanish and Puerto Rican, like in a Puerto Rican accent, and using Puerto Rican slang. I learned Spanish from all sorts of different countries and their slang, and Spanglish and African American vernacular. And also, I speak kind of a little bit busted, even though I speak like great Spanish. Why would I have the book? And my voice in the book is so informal, and it's really inspired by hip hop. And so there's a lot of posturing where I'm kind of a brat, and it's vulgar. Why would it be written in like the Spanish used to translate Don Quixote? So I turned that translation down, and we're now looking for a translator who would be able to translate it into proper Latinx Spanish.
I love it. That's amazing. Me encanta. Okay, otra pregunta más. So Rebecca wants to know if you are working on your next book, and what will be the topic.
Yes, I am working on a young adult novel called Dream Girl, and that's coming out next year. And that's sort of about a young music writer in New York whose dad is in sanctuary. And then my book after that will be a nonfiction collection of essays about cults.
So Karla, one of the things that we discussed a lot with our Latinx students and our Latinx youth, specifically, at the University of Connecticut, we talked a lot about aspirational capital. So the last question I have for you is, if you could please tell us about your next aspirations and the dreams that Karla Cornejo Villavicencio has.
That's a really good question. I haven't been asked that. This question comes at an interesting time for me. And I'm glad we're ending because we can end on this note. I talk in my book pretty openly about my lifelong journey with suicide ideation. I was suicidal for most of my life. And a lot of it had to do, I think, with untreated traumas from migration and my separation from my parents when I was a kid. And there's just not a lot of resources for people like me, you know? Even if you have money, even if you have insurance, if you don't, there's not therapists trained to work with people like you. There aren't many people like you, you know? At first I was so concerned with just the precarity of my daily life. And then once I got out, once I started becoming successful in the ways that I had dreamed of since I was a child, I became worried that like nothing was going to solve the emptiness that I had. And part of the mental illness that I have, which is borderline personality disorder, is a profound sense of emptiness. And so for a long time, I was like, people would be like, "Oh, what's your dream?" And my dream when I was a child was to write for the New Yorker, and that happened last year. And I was like, well, there has to be a bigger dream. And I felt like my dream was to find peace. And when I was younger, I thought that the only way that I would be able to find peace was death, because I was undocumented. My parents were poor. They were getting sick. I mean, I felt like I had all the odds against me. Plus, I was so sensitive. I was depressive. I had anxiety. And then I decided to work really, really hard to find a reason to, or multiple reasons to live, and not just, as we say all the time in communities of color and queer communities, you want to find a reason to live and not just survive, right? And I worked really hard at alternatives for resistant treatment depression. And I worked really hard at the behavioral therapy for my illness, which is called DBT. And I, for the past few months, I've been feeling like I can make goals other than just finding peace. So I think some of the goals are, I want to write this very good novel that I'm working on now, that before I just thought of writing the best that I could at the time. But now I just want to write a really great novel. And I'd like to move out of this apartment and find a place that has a backyard for my dog that's fenced in, because he's a Boston Terrier and he's very bad. And I hope to continue writing the kinds of things that will help other queer kids, other children of immigrants, find a reason to keep going that isn't their parents, or isn't helping the community, or isn't just surviving, but something that genuinely brings them some happiness and not just peace.
Karla, muchísimas gracias por tu honestidad, por tu voz, por ser tú tan valiente y por amplificar las voces de nuestros undocumented Americans.
Muchas gracias.
So thank you so much. And I think I'm going to pass it to Mariana right now.
Hi. Oh, thank you both so much. That was so powerful. I teared up at one point. So thank you very much, both of you, for being here with us today, for speaking with us so candidly. And also thank you to all of our viewers for all your wonderful questions. Before we sign off, if I could just take a quick minute to tell you some of our future programs coming up at Connecticut's Old State House. Why isn't that coming? There you go. Okay, so on Thursday, April the 15th at 7 p.m., we have a chat with Dr. Dennis Collington about the Witness Stones Project. And also on April the 22nd, Thursday, April the 22nd at noon, we have a panel led by Dr. Jeff Patridge of Hartford Capital Community College. We're going to be talking about the Talcott Street Congregational Church, which is the first Black church here in Connecticut. And we'll be also joined by Dr. Barbara Beeching, Dr. Frank Mitchell, Professor Antoinette Brimbell, and Dr. Duncan Harris. And yeah, again, please, everybody, if you can take a minute to fill out our survey, which you can find a link to that on the description of this video. And again, Fanny and Karla, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And thank you all of our viewers for being with us tonight. And I hope you have a very pleasant evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Muchísimas gracias.